We first are being, then we're doing, and then we're having. And I think in the modern society, we jump through those hoops and we either want to do things or we want to just have things, right? And we skip the being, and focusing on cultivating this state of peace and being in touch with your higher self and not your ego self is so important. And I do truly believe that none of the regeneration work is possible until people focus on cultivating this state of being in touch with oneself, state of compassion, acting out of love and not out of ego.
Hello, ReFi Podcast. Welcome to the second and last bonus episode of Season 4, the Regeneration Nexus. It feels like a big moment, and this episode is also special because it's just the two of us. And we went through everything from our favorite learnings from the season, the current state of ReFi comms, and even some personal regeneration practices. So we hope you enjoy it. Maya, what did you think?
I agree. This was not an easy one for me, though, to be honest. It was challenging to be the stars of the show and not hide behind the speaker as we did in previous episodes. But this one was probably also one of the most rewarding episodes for me because this was the occasion for us to look back at the work we've done with Season 4, connect the dots, review how the Regeneration Nexus came to life from our concept to the real implementation. And my favorite moment from this episode was our discussion on the connection between ReFi and inner regeneration and why personal mindfulness practices are key for a systemic change. And we also touch on rose, buds, and thorns of Season 4. So let us know your favorite moments in the comments and let's dive into it.
Maya, how are you doing today?
Hi, Tereza. I'm not going to lie, I'm really nervous because as you all know, all of our episodes have been interview-based and we had a guest who we were picking the brain of. And today it's just the two of us and it is quite nerve-wracking, but I'm excited to take on this challenge and actually distill all of the learnings we've had over the course of this journey. How about you, Tereza?
Yeah, same. I'm really excited because I know we've had a chance to reflect on things, after every episode, but it's great also, to get your point of view on the overall theme. So maybe let's start with that. Maya, can you share a little bit about how the idea for the season, the Regeneration Nexus, came to be?
Sure. Yeah, so I remember when we first started brainstorming about Season 4 of the ReFi Podcast, we really wanted to have a conceptual background, like a through line so that each episode flows into another. And I think we also had our own pet peeves about the space and what's missing. And I remember we were like, okay, let's start from the basics, right? What is regeneration? Well, what is, this first letter in ReFi, right? Re stands for regeneration, regenerative finance. And I think we both really wanted to dive deeper into what regeneration really is and what it means, and really look at the foundational principles, the philosophy and the economic principles. So that kind of gave rise to the first mini-series that we decided to frame around the vision or why we even need this paradigm shift. And that's how the first 4 episodes were organized into, exploring what regeneration is, other approaches to regeneration like bioregionalism, plurality with Glenn, looking at the bigger picture of our legal systems and how we can reshape them to reflect the rights of nature with Tony. So that was the first mini-series. And then the second part, we really wanted to dive into real examples. And it's important to know that obviously there are plenty of other examples. So the ones that we picked it's not an exhaustive list. I think one of the main reasons we picked the speakers in the second new series of the practice is the projects that haven't received much attention yet. Because, the podcast existed for 3 seasons before we started the 4th one. And we really wanted to give the stage to newer ideas, newer projects. So that's how the second mini-series came to life, called The Practice. So we focused on this question, what would it really take to regenerate in practice, with some real world examples. And that's where we had Ebru with regenerative investing, and we had Pete Cork with his really cool project on investing in forest restoration in Canada, with Kennedy, with DMRVs in Africa. And it was really cool to look at those examples and the challenges that, come along with them. And lastly, obviously, the ReFi is fundamentally centered around Web3, and technology is a big part of the ethos of this movement. So we could not talk about technology. So the third mini-series became the tools. So what do we need to create this regeneration in practice? What kinds of tools and technological innovation can help us achieve regenerative vision? But also maybe what are some of the dangers with glorifying the tools? And maybe we'll dive more into that. And I really appreciated approaches by Jessica and Danielle focusing on how we could build tools in a regenerative way. Conversations with Anna Lerner from Climate Collective, from Wes, from Hedera. Yeah, so lots to dive into. But I guess the bottom line is we structured the whole season along these 3 mini-series that kind of created this nexus. And hopefully our listeners notice some of those intersecting parts. Yeah. Do you have anything to add to that, Tereza? How did the nexus come to life for you?
Yeah, I think it was really balanced. I really loved seeing, kind of telling the whole story of regeneration through these 3 different miniseries. And also, I'm really proud with the quality of speakers that we were able to bring on the show, because we had people from different backgrounds. We have, economists, we have eco-viewers, we have technologists. And I think what I loved seeing is that it was somehow like reaffirming, right? Because we're always talking about these things, and it sometimes feel like we're in a bubble, but kind of seeing people from different geographies, different walks of life, kind of reaffirmed that this is important work. I think was real beautiful for me, and, almost like wholesome with, episodes, for example, with Tony Lai or with Pete working with indigenous communities. So I'm really happy with how it came to be. And I want to ask you, Maya, if you maybe could pick one moment from the season that really resonated with you the most, can be personally or professionally, which one would you choose?
So many moments to think about. It's hard to pick one. I would say the overall highlight of the season was that the episode with John Fullerton. And to me, it was kind of like a full circle moment, because I also took his course on regenerative economics, and having him as one of the first guests, setting that foundation for regeneration. And I think very importantly, expanding our understanding of what regenerative finance could be, right? Beyond just the bubble of ReFi, and how we can look at things like investment as a bridge to this regenerative change that we want to see in the world. I really liked just his methodological approach to regeneration that really distills it in a way that's, to me, was just easier to grasp, had real examples and super interesting concepts like recycling capital, right? And how we can compose financial capital, right? And turn it into other forms of capital. And I think that was such an important moment to set that foundation. Like, oh, okay, regenerative finance is not just about financial capital. How can we create other forms of capital through the practice of making finance more regenerative, and, and have this a more holistic approach? And I just love his constant framework throughout his work that, he warns us against having this reductionist thinking, which I think we, especially kind of in this Western neoclassical society that we live in, are used to live, just distilling everything to simple economic or financial terms. And the world is so much more complex. And I encourage everyone who wants to learn more about regeneration on the kind of a bigger, high level, look into his work on regenerative capitalism, on regenerative economics, specifically his 8 principles of regenerative vitality, which it was very cool to see how some of those principles were actually reflected in some of our other speakers, even though they didn't really talk about them directly. Yeah, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so I like that you mentioned John Fullerton's episode, because that was probably my favorite as well. And the insight about composting financial capital was really something that I'm taking away from this, because the fact that we can compose or reinvest surplus financial capital into ecological, social, or cultural capital, I think to me means that we can like completely redefine how we see things like philanthropy and investment, because I think we tend to see them as like something additional, right? Something that's going to only cost us, but we don't think about the benefits. And it made me think a lot about, the forests as an ecosystem and how, the trees are growing and the leaves are falling and they're like coming like or bringing more minerals to the soil, and it's like a interconnected ecosystem. But I think in the traditional financial systems, we're only like optimizing for growth, but ignoring for like entropy, right? So what happens when you cut down the trees? Like how is the ecosystem going to sustain itself? And that made me think a lot about, how regenerative systems are also resilient. And I remember reading about it in Kevin Owaki's Greenfield book like years ago as well. And just like felt like it all came together in this moment, kind of seeing how, for example, with like global supply chains, right, that we saw that during the pandemic, how they like collapsed. So regenerative systems, I think, things like material circularity or more localized production, I think can really, benefit us all. And kind of hearing this from a veteran economist that John is was really like an important moment for me. And to bring it to the real world, I always think of companies like Patagonia that reinvest their profits into fighting climate crisis. And it's really like showing the shift from growth for just growth's sake to like proper systemic stewardship. So yeah, I think like that has gotten me really excited.
Yeah, absolutely. And your point reminded me of another thing that I'm really excited about the episode that I believe we were able to achieve is we really wanted to look at this ReFi movement, not just within this Web3 bubble, right? And build more of these partnerships with the Web2, traditional world, legacy world. People have different names for it. And that's why it was so important for us to bring guests like John, like Jessica and Danielle, and people who are kind of outside of this traditional Web3 kind of ReFi bubble that we know. And it's cool to see that their ideas intersect with some of the, Web3 OGs, like you mentioned, Kevin Owaki, right? And it's cool to see how this kind of these intersections and connections that's what regeneration is, right?
Totally. I was actually thinking when I was going through my notes, looking at bioregionalism, how it has so many things in common with DeFi. How like you're creating like decentralized nodes that are centered around, like physical locations can be, but there is like different like governance approaches. And so I was like, oh, this is also, I don't know, beautiful and like organic, and how we can find like similarities in different things. So totally.
Yeah. And speaking of regenerative approach or, learning from nature as one of these reflection exercises, I like this rose, bud, and thorn approach. Have you heard about it?
No, I saw it in your notes, but I don't know what it means.
Oh, I'm so excited. I would love for us to look back at the season through the lens of rose, bud, and thorn. What it means is rose is something that was the most exciting moment for you in the season, right? It's like what's bloomed for you. Bud would be something that just starting to blossom, maybe something promising. And then thorn, something can be a challenge, more like a negative moment. So let's adopt this framework. What was the rose in the season for you, Tereza?
I think one thing that comes to mind of like something that I got really excited about is in a conversation with Glenn Weil, he was talking about how we could use language models to translate sensor data from ecological features into speech and create something like a Lorax who speaks for the trees. And I didn't know what a Lorax was until I Googled it after. And it's like a Dr. Seuss character who is basically like a guardian of nature and advocates for trees, against mass destruction. And I really like the idea of creating like these modern day Loraxes and basically, use sensors and data from sensors to get insights from things or bodies like rivers, forests, oceans on things like pollution or like deforestation. And I think it's really fascinating because we could get insights into how nature is feeling or what it's thinking. So you could have, I don't know, a forest tell you like, oh, I'm losing 10 hectares per week. Please help me. And it made me also think about Tony Lay's episode because he was talking about, legal personhood for nature. I think he was mentioning the example of New Zealand that was really fascinating, how we can better advocate for nature. And I think giving nature voice to advocate for itself is something that could be really interesting. But the reason why it fascinates me the most is that I've always been interested in maybe ways we can shape human behavior. And in the impact world, there is so many concepts around this, related to the human psychology, right? There is the having the mediated experience versus having the direct experience, or things like moral distance, right? How do we get people to care about this cause when they feel so distant from it, in their everyday reality, right? So coming back to it, I think Glenn's vision here is that, we can use these tools to break down barriers and create more empathy and visibility and reduce this moral distance. And I think that really nicely ties into plurality, because we don't only have to do this with nature, but also with our communities. How can we better understand problems that are so abstract and make them more tangible and inspire action? So I think this is probably my bloom. So if I'm understanding correctly, BUD is something that has started growing and could become really exciting or flourish in the future. So what would be your BUD?
Yeah, it's funny because to me, when I first thought about the BUD, the two things that you mentioned were BUDs for me as legal personhood, but this concept that Tani brought up, because kind of the legal aspects of a regenerative change, I feel are very new to me. So this is definitely a topic I want to explore more. And the second one, how do we reduce polarization and embrace the diversity, and how conflict could be actually a force for positive change? When you were speaking of plurality, what it also reminded me, right, of Samantha's episode on bioregionalism, and how, right, the main motivation for her to even start this book on bioregional financing facilities is the reality that so much of our financial resources is centralized, right? And there's no diversity in how we fund public goods, things we share in communities, and how it's fundamentally not regenerative, right? And how can we bring this diversity or plurality in the ways that we fund regenerative projects? I think to me that was a very cool, interesting connection. Another thing as something that is promising and what I've gathered from this season is, and something that excites me, is this collaboration between Web 2 and Web 3. The point I mentioned earlier, it was really cool to have someone like Azim who talked about creating partnerships, right, and building bridges with existing institutions. So it's very cool example, UNICEF Crypto Fund, right? I'm really curious to explore where crypto philanthropy is going to go in the future, right? So that's something that hopefully will flourish. And I'm curious to follow this trend and just kind of his take on how we don't need to reinvent the systems, right? We don't need to completely move away from existing institutions. How do we create better partnerships? So to me, that was another BUD moment.
That's a great one, because I think, what I sometimes struggle with in the ReFi space is that it feels very up in the clouds, and we are failing, to connect with the methodologies and the institutions that are already doing the work. And maybe they're not doing it in the perfect way, but I think, there's a lot of potential in entering and collaborating and leveraging the networks that they have already built.
Yeah. And that actually reminds me of another promising moment. Oh my gosh, I feel there's so many examples. And another thing that Azim brought up, and actually that we kind of reflected a little bit in the episode with Kennedy, but I definitely want to do more of that in the future, right? Is how does regeneration look like outside of the West, right? How do we bring more examples of regenerative projects from, Africa, Asia, other parts of the world? Because back to actually Samantha's point that, regeneration happens in place, even though these ideas travel globally, but regeneration looks differently in different contexts. So another promising part for me would be to explore more examples and initiatives that come sort of outside of the quote unquote developed world.
Yeah, and that makes me think again about the episode we did with Constanza, because she was talking a lot about how you need to understand, the local culture, and you cannot just craft these one size fits all solutions and then, bring them onto a community literally. And I think that's something that I see a lot as well, like working, for example, on ReFi Medellin, like it would be easy to say, okay, like we are using Telegram for everything. So let's just like gather our community on Telegram, but nobody here uses it. Everyone uses WhatsApp. So can we create like a WhatsApp group instead? And that's a very like simplistic example. But I think, yeah, the overall point, of really understanding the community. And you mentioned Kennedy does really great work on that, because I remember he was saying that like 70% of their work is like literally spending time with the community. So yeah, like really excited for more real world use cases, especially in Latin America, Africa, and Asia as well.
Yeah, yeah. I love how through our conversation, we actually are starting to see some of these connections because, like even like in my notes, I don't have this all like planned out, but as you were speaking, yeah, Constance's point and Kennedy's examples of DMRV and Africa, and then, importance of culture was also brought up by Ebru, right? In the episode on regenerative investing, one of the biggest points that she made was how it's so important to understand the context that we are right investing in, and listening to the community is not coming with those one size fits all kind of solutionist approach. So it's really cool how, all these different speakers kind of brought up some of these elements that hopefully form a somewhat coherent picture for the listeners. Please tell us if you feel the same way in the comments. And again, I guess lastly, Tereza, what was your Thorn moment? What was the kind of the biggest challenge or pessimistic concept?
Yeah, that's a tough one, but I guess I shouldn't be surprised, but sometimes it's still kind of surprising, to, I guess, hear about like the dire realities. I remember Anna was telling us that 25% of land is governed and stewarded by indigenous communities, but they get like less than 1% of climate funding. Or when Wes was telling us about COP29, and then I was kind of doing some research and I saw that there were like 1,700 oil and gas lobbyists present, which is more than like representatives from the key countries. Or, when Pete was telling us about how a tree is more valuable when it's cut down than when it's in a forest. So I think kind of like thinking about the urgency of this work, but also got me like really hopeful. But yeah, I guess it's still a thorn. Do you have one too?
Oh my gosh, totally agree with all the examples you mentioned. And I would just add, yeah, I think John was the one who kind of brought up the concept of polycrisis, right? And the intersection of a variety of, it's ecological crisis, but also social crisis and political crisis that we as a society are facing. And as a result, the need for this paradigm shift, the sad reality, exactly what you said. And I think another more recent one, we live in this craze for AI right now, right? Everyone talks about AI and how there's so much potential, kind of similar to the rise of crypto and that hype a few years ago. And very few people talk about the material realities of what this increased usage of AI means. And I appreciated Jessica and Danielle's points that, look, the more we use AI, the more actual physical servers we need on the ground, the more energy we need to run these servers. And there's some crazy statistics how much energy like a single AI search uses versus just a Google search, for example. And also Danielle's point of how a lot of these big tech companies are rolling back on their environmental pledges and their energy pledges, because all of a sudden there's all this demand for AI and they need to use more energy. So yeah, I guess I appreciated Anna's point that AI definitely has a lot of potential in, helping us optimize methodologies for ecological credits and things like that. But at the same time, right, the material reality of living in the age of AI is also something that kind of scares me. And I think we need more conversations about, what that actually means for communities where those servers are located.
Totally. And, I remember when ChatGPT was just getting started almost, and there were a lot of AI generated images on Twitter, especially related to regeneration. And I remember seeing an article that said that to generate one image is as energy costly as charging your phone 4 times. And I was like, wow, like if, for example, Jessica and Daniel said that regenerative technology is technology in service to life, it makes sense to use technology to advance regeneration. But again, like as you're saying, at what cost, right? So I think that's going to be a huge topic for this year, and hopefully we'll get to explore it some more as well.
Absolutely. And I think another thorn moment that comes to mind for me is I think it's just like one of those big challenges to refi as a movement is kind of lack of a viable business model, right? And we are noticing that's in, something that Azim brought up and how kind of this just reliance on grant money over long term is not really sustainable. So if we really want this movement to succeed and grow, we need to address the realities of the importance of sustainable funding models.
Totally. And actually, that makes me think of the exciting announcement that Octant made just last week, I think, about dedicating their next epoch to climate projects. So it's great to see that, there is more kind of work and funding going towards that. But you're right that it's all about creating models that last and, like benefit the communities. But I guess moving on, I also wanted to spend some time today, to talk about our personal journeys and maybe things that we don't usually get to discuss that can still be related to regeneration. But to kick it off, I want to know, Maya, because I don't think we've ever properly discussed this, but I want to know about your ReFi journey. And did you have a moment where you thought okay, this is what I really want to dedicate my work to?
Wow, yeah, that's an interesting question because I've always been into impact work and I was fascinated by emerging technologies and environmental organizations. But this kind of connection between Web3 and regeneration got formed for me when I came across hashtag ReFi. I think actually one of the first ReFi podcasts when John was the host, I remember listening to it and thinking, what is this ReFi thing? But what also is regeneration? Because I was familiar with concepts of circular economics, donut economics, but regeneration was something completely new. And that's kind of what sent me down the rabbit hole of, okay, regenerative economics. And that I came across John Fullerton's work and his early white paper on regenerative capitalism. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, is such thing even possible? What is regenerative capitalism? So I think all of these ideas sparked my interest. And then I started looking at examples, learn about projects like Regen Network, and also connecting the dots on the promise of Web3 for transparency, for climate finance. And at the time I was doing my master's degree in grad school. And another moment, I think, throughout my story was I was offered to collaborate on a research project with the World Economic Forum, where we actually got to interview all the kind of OG people in ReFi, asking them, so what is the benefit of blockchain for climate finance? And we published a white paper on that same title. But I remember doing those mini interviews thinking wow, this is fascinating. And later on, learning about ReFi DAO and their work, going to events and taking John's course, and that all kind of clicked. But again, regeneration is not static, right? It's dynamic, and learn about systems change. It's a process. So I'm still definitely in the learning phase.
I want to know, do you feel like there is a project that maybe you started following really early on that you still follow and you feel like is really doing well?
Yeah, well, like I mentioned, I think Regen Network and also Cello Blockchain were those first two that I remember seeing early on. Another one, actually, Ethic Hub as well. They were one of the first ones. And I also just love coffee. And I think also regenerative agriculture was one of those examples that was easier for me to grasp what regeneration meant on land. So those are the ones that come to mind.
Yeah, I would actually, I think, say Ethic Hub as well for me. And then obviously Givet. They are really the OGs. And I love seeing how their platform is being used more and more. And then I actually don't know if you know the project, but you probably do. Plastics. They're from Spain. Yeah, I think they're really cool. And I remember when I learned about them, it was exactly like my moment, like, whoa, this is possible. Because they're using basically certificates of plastic recycling to generate NFTs to, show it as a proof of plastic being recycled. And what I loved about them is that they, I think last year entered in a huge partnership with the football club in Barcelona. And it's really cool to see that because, if the football club implements this system and sells these NFTs to their fans, they can offer them, additional benefits, whether that's like social cloud or, I don't know, like discounts on merch. They make sure that their plastic are offset and it creates like these kind of like beautiful loop that I think, we should be seeing more of. Like I would be super excited to have an NFT like that. And yeah, it creates like a whole different like new ways of interacting. So that's really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually did interview Andre from Plastics. I feel like it's been so many years ago that, yeah, I totally forgot. That's a great example of the project. But yeah, Teresa, kind of going along the lines of personal story, I'm curious to learn more about your story, but specifically, what kinds of unique perspectives and experiences do you bring to the table to ReFi?
Yeah, I think, like I'm very passionate about storytelling. Before working in Web3, I worked in PR and, as a first, like as a ghostwriter, then as an editor. And the most important thing always was to ask, okay, like, what's the story here? Right. And we would have people come to us, like we were working mostly with little tech startups, and they'd say, okay, we have this announcement to share. And I'm like, okay, what is the story? Right? Like, why do you want to share this? Why does it matter to the community? And I think what I'm really good at is like looking at those and like also be like very sober and direct when it comes to this work. And, I think in ReFi, we actually need more stories. And I always think about this because I'm thinking about things like DeFi, right? What is the big stories for Bitcoin? I think when you were on your journey with Web3, you probably heard about these big stories, I don't know, the Bitcoin pizza that now, became a whole thing. First, maybe it was negative or I don't know. And then it became like this whole thing. And there's a pizza DAO now that hosts like pizza events, but like you easily associate it with that story or, the mysterious Satoshi Nakamoto and El Salvador adopting Bitcoin as its currency. So all these things I think are really important, almost like totems that I think we need to be seeing more in the ReFi space. And I think that, I kind of see it almost like as my personal mission to help bring these stories and kind of bridge, the Web3 space, the real world more. And I think that's why comms is so important. And, I know like I'm kind of tooting my own horn. I'm a marketer, like a comms person, right? So I guess I have to say it by nature, but really I think that comms help, make ideas discoverable, basically. Because, even on this podcast, maybe we are not going to exactly interview the next Vitalik Buterin of ReFi, but I think we're still making like important connections here because maybe, someone's going to message Pete and say like, hey, I love what you're doing in Canada. I want to bring that model somewhere else. And, maybe they do, and maybe it's not going to work that great, but maybe they're going to write about it and then someone's going to take it and do it better. So I think we're with comms, it's like with open source software, right? Like open source software creates like this invisible scaffolding for the next person to come in. Okay, what does this person then? Can I make it better? Can I build up on it? And I think we're doing the same here with ideas in comms. So I love projects that are sharing their lessons, their learnings, even if it's, the failures, because I think that's how we build capacity in the space. And that's kind of where I see my personal role in the space.
Yay, regen media and regen marketing. It's so important. I agree with you, oftentimes overlooked in this space. And you mentioned the importance of storytelling, but what makes a ReFi story effective? Do you have any takes on where ReFi marketing stands right now? Maybe your pet peeves and what do you think is
Started.
Please do, please do. So how can we make ReFi narratives or create these new mental frameworks? How can we make them more lasting?
Yeah, I think first thing is, I really love Bruce metaphors, for example, and I remember noting down a few. For example, she was saying that if a flower is not growing, do you blame the flower or do you think, okay, is it getting enough sun? Is it getting enough water? How are the conditions in the soil? And I think, metaphors like these really help, break down these difficult concepts into something that's more tangible. But I think overall, when it comes to, creating and sharing ReFi stories, I would say I wouldn't want to see that much AI when it comes to content creation. And the second big thing is that I want to see more precise case studies. I think that's a big one for me because, I can tell you all about how Eleanor's Ostrom like principles to govern the commons say that, maybe community-driven governance is not just ethical, but also effective. But saying this doesn't really prove anything, right? But if I can show you numbers, and I love some case studies, for example, from Regen Network, from their Jaguar credits in the Amazons, or I love seeing Mercy Corp's Ventures pilot around stablecoins, because that makes me think like, okay, this is, actually something tangible. And this is, I think, how we build legitimacy. But I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts on that? And also, maybe Maya, I would love to know how has your thinking about all this changed over time and maybe over the season as well?
Yeah, I would say creating a podcast and being a podcast host taught me a lot about the importance of marketing and being an effective storyteller. And that's definitely work in progress. And I think it's an interesting challenge now figuring out this new relationship with the tools like AI that can absolutely be helpful. But I agree with you. How can we still use them to make our work easier and maybe more efficient? But how do we not lose our humanity in the process? And I think that's what we've been discussing and how we want to implement more of a human-centric approach in the sort of world of AI-generated content. Another one for me is what kind of language do we speak? And I mean it more metaphorically, right? So do we speak the language or do we use the terms that other people would understand? If we really want to bridge across the aisle, make those partnerships with other organizations, NGOs, even governments, right? And that's actually another important element that was brought up in some of the episodes this season, specifically Pete's work with Quaxala and how they were able to create those legal partnerships with the government of Canada, right? And if we really want this to scale, we gotta involve governments at some level, right? We can't just completely, deny the importance of political structures that already exist. Yes, we can improve them, right? And incorporate approaches like plurality and more decentralized governance, like we talked about. But we also need to embrace realities. And when it comes to marketing and storytelling, how do we communicate our message in a language that's easy to understand? And I think that's probably the biggest challenge for me personally, and I think just for this community as well, is it's just so interdisciplinary and so complex because regeneration as a concept, right? In and of itself, such a multi-layered new approach that needs its own level of understanding, right? And then when we layer things like Web3 on top of it, right? A lot of people have a hard time grasping what Web3 even is, and fairly so, because I don't think we're doing the best job of explaining. And I think there's also lack of some resources that they distill it in ways that people can understand. So I don't know about you, but it's definitely been a struggle to even explaining to some of my friends outside of sort of the ReFi community what the podcast even is and what we're trying to achieve here.
Yeah, totally. Actually, I was talking to Ken from Carbon Copy about this exact thing yesterday because we were thinking about okay, regenerative finance is not just, a technological shift, but it's also a whole economic shift. And you're asking people, to change their entire behaviors. And oftentimes there is not even language for that. Literally, sometimes. And actually, I'm giving the ReFi space some credit for this because I know that, things like what you mentioned with Pete, a right to regenerate. What does that even mean, right? Or different metrics. We're always stuck thinking about GDP, but how do you measure the health of an ecosystem, And this is where, I don't know, the 8 forms of capital come in and different concepts. I think somebody, I'm not sure who it was, but they mentioned National Index of Happiness in Bhutan. And everyone was talking about, okay, how do we measure whether girls can get to school safely? So I really love seeing, this kind of new thinking about metrics and language and different frameworks like the ecological benefits framework that I think Pete also mentioned. So that's something that has me really excited.
Yeah, but also, you were saying regeneration is an economic shift, but it's also a mindset shift, right? And it's a different way of seeing. And back to your example of happiness measuring in Bhutan, right? A lot of the themes that we see around regeneration are not just how to, restore, revitalize ecological planetary health, right? Is how do we regenerate within, and why it's important to even focus on this topic of inner regeneration. And I know both you and I are very into this topic as both yoga practitioners. So I really wanted to dive a little bit more into that because, unintentionally, quite a few episodes touched on this topic, right? Glenn was the one who brought up spirituality and technology connection. Then we had Danielle from the Regenerative Technology episode talking about the importance of mindfulness for tech builders, right? So why is inner regeneration important in your opinion?
Yeah, I think it's about having that balance, right? And I don't want to sound too techy, but I think that like if you take care of yourself, like you can take care of, what's around you. And like it's like, yeah, like you're your mind. So that's something that, I always like try to think about. And I know there are studies that say that like even just by like looking into greenery, you can reduce your chance of like having depression by 70%. So, like whether it's like being in nature, doing yoga, or being involved, I think in my community always like really fulfills me and, makes me feel, yeah, like tied to a place and to a local purpose. And I think that's really important. And I think that's maybe something that, we also kind of touched upon, even though we didn't really explore much with Timur in our bonus episode about pop-up communities, because I think it's really important for us, at the end of the day, with all technology and stuff, to still feel human. And that's why I love communities like the traditional Dream Factory that are doing that, and that invite you to stay there and participate and contribute to the community. So I hope I get to go. But Maya, I want to know about your personal regeneration practices and maybe if you have some tips you want to share with us.
Yeah, sure. I think I came to kind of the spiritual work out of necessity, really. The stress of the pandemic and being quite pessimistic about the state of the world, with all the polycrisis that we talk about. So to learn how to navigate the stress and come back to center and improve my mental state, I got into yoga and through that into meditation practices. And through learning about kind of the yoga philosophy, the only permanent thing is change. And I realized how much I'm trying to control things around me and how it's so important to release that control. And the only thing we can ever really control is our own mental state, our thoughts, right? And this practice of mindfulness is important because it's kind of this mental gym, right? It helps us to focus on our thoughts and let them go. And, through that, practice this kind of non-attachment, releasing control, letting, energy, ideas flow through us, and also accepting that the impermanence. And another thing that I really appreciate about this kind of inner regeneration work is like one of my teachers told me this, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Why? Like now it all makes sense. She said that the state, our mental state, is the first thing. It's primary. What I mean by that, we first are being, then we're doing, and then we're having. And I think in the modern society, we jump through those hoops and we either want to do things or we want to just have things, right? And we skip the being, and focusing on cultivating this state of peace and being in touch with your higher self and not your ego self is so important. And I do truly believe that none of the regeneration work is possible until people focus on cultivating this state of being in touch with oneself, state of compassion, acting out of love, right? And not out of ego. So that's kind of what this inner regeneration work means to me. And again, and I think another thing that I see is that yoga is not an end goal. It's a journey, yeah, with dedication and intention. So how can we live our lives like that?
Beautiful. I love when you said about being, I remember, I think I was joking with Bram from Glow Dollar about this in Brussels at ECC. You're like, I'm not a human being, I'm a human doing, with just like how busy we get sometimes. So I love that you mentioned that. I'm wondering, is there like a concept in yoga that you feel like also relates a lot to the values of ReFi?
Yeah, like I said, I think a big part about yoga is realization that there's this illusion of separation, right? And actually at the core, we are one, right? And we have this higher self, but then we have this kind of this internal conflict between our higher self and our ego self. And a lot of the extraction and violence, kind of the reason for all the polycrisis that we're seeing is actually that a lot of people internalize this conflict, there's a separation, right? And see us as separate from nature, separate from each other. And while when we have this separation, it's easier to do harm. But when we remind ourselves that we are one, we breathe the same air as all other beings in this world, it creates this level of compassion that, that it makes it so much harder to do bad in the world, right? And I really appreciated Tony's meditation, actually, that he did at the opening of his episode. And I encourage everyone, if you haven't listened to it, go find it on our YouTube channel. We have a short of just the meditation if you don't want to listen to the whole episode, where it was a regenerative meditation and how he really connected us with nature. Like when you do those mindfulness practices, right? Look inward and listen to your voice and realize like, oh my gosh, I'm breathing, return to breath. And speaking of practical tools, definitely intentional breathing is important. If you want to try something simple, I like box breath. It means you can inhale on the count, let's say 4, hold your breath for 4 counts, exhale on the count of 4, hold your breath at the bottom for 4. So kind of like that box. It really, calms your nervous system, and you really start noticing the incredible things like the miracle of life. I think the fact that we are alive and how complex our bodies are, and the gratitude for this miracle. When was the last time you looked at the palm of your hand and all the intricate, beautiful lines that exist, right? That such beautiful attention to detail. And I think the more we notice those little things, the more there's a genuine sense of gratitude for the world, for life, and how regeneration is. How do we create conditions for the life to thrive? Yeah, I feel like I'm going on a tangent here.
No, you're touching my heart. I love it. This is really beautiful. Like, if we're sharing resources, I do want to share one as well. The book Bhagavad Gita, which is like basically the yogic Bible, because I'm currently rereading it, and it's just like full of really beautiful reflections that you can just like open anywhere and read a page and be like, wow, okay, this is something that I can reflect upon. And just recently I went through the section where they talk about how your mind can be your best friend, but also your greatest enemy, right? So all this work that we can do. And as you said, like it all starts within like how we see the world, how we relate to others. That's why I always like in ReFi also talk about like positive sum games, right? Because I think that like if you do well, it's like gonna come back to you eventually, and you don't have to like worry about the outcomes. You don't have to like wait around like, okay, when is this fruit finally gonna, mature for me to consume? No, it's like more always like giving your best and, connecting and sharing and kind of doing the work and, hoping that it comes back, because it eventually does in one way or another. So yeah, that would be my input here. Yeah, but we also had some great knowledge shared by our guests in the rapid fire section asking about their mantras. So here's a rundown of them.
Something that Rick Rubin says in his book, The Creative Act, A Way of Being, that there are ideas that have a time to be born, and they find a way to express themselves through us.
When I started Capital Institute, there's a Goethe quote, which I'll butcher, but it's something like, just begin. There's energy in starting, so just begin. I can't remember the actual quote, but that's really what I decided to do when I started Capital Institute. I had all these ideas, couldn't figure out exactly what it was supposed to be, what it was supposed to do, but I just began. And that was a good decision. But I can't remember the quote. The fullness in beginning or something like that.
Well, a quote from the Tao Te Ching. It says, 30 spokes meet in a hub, and yet the useful part of the wheel is where it's empty. That we build the pot, but what holds things is the empty space inside.
The latest one is, how do you attune to a paradox? So it's just a question to think about and ask others. It's a great one for parties.
So many quotes that inspire me. I think it's, you're playing small doesn't serve the world. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier. And I wish I could remember where it comes from. I've got another one that might be more interesting, which is, now, and I'm going to have to apologize if I don't get it word perfect, but never think a small group of committed people with a new idea can't change the world. It's the only thing that ever has. I think that's another really important message. And, I think it's been used in Apple advertising in bits and pieces, but it's like, you have got the power to change the world. Everybody does. Yeah, we just got to do it. And, that is what, we got to do it. We've got to get off our bums.
There is actually, so it's from Goethe and about commitment. Until one is committed, there is hesitancy, the chance to draw back, always ineffectiveness. Concerning all acts of initiative and creation, there is one elementary truth, the ignorance of which kills countless ideas and splendid plans. That the moment one definitely commits oneself, then providence moves too. It's been a big one for me.
I would say it is just to do it. Just do it. I think one of the biggest challenges that I've seen is people are normally afraid of taking the first step and doing something that they really dream of. And just do it is one of the things that I would advise anyone. Take the first step and everything else will eventually fall into place.
You can do good for the world and do well financially at the same time. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
Do no harm. And it's been that way since I was a teenager. And in the early days of environmental world, the precautionary principle was it as far as how we innovate. And it never got adopted, no matter how much the leading activists around the world tried to bring it into the UN. And I wonder how principles like that could get adopted now into technology and innovation. I'm not saying that technology and innovation shouldn't reach the market, but if we operated with the principle of do no harm, maybe it would take longer for certain technologies to enter the market so that they could be more socially and environmentally responsible in their approach. And I would be quite okay with that.
What comes to mind for me now is a quote by Lean Gorison: the nature of the future of innovation and innovation of the future of nature are interconnected.
I learned this some years ago from the founder and director of the International Leadership Program from Yale University, which is also the founder of a fellowship I'm in right now, of Climate Fellowship. And she said, Constanza, just remind yourself to let yourself evolve. And I think that when we let ourselves evolve, we become more intentional in lessons, we become more humble in opportunities, and we become more conscious about ethical frameworks for decision making.
I'm really deep in Zen Buddhism right now. So we inter-are or interbeing would probably be one thing that I think about a lot. I am nature. We are nature. Nature is all around us. If I hurt nature, I hurt me or my children or people. So that's an important one for me right now.
When you wake up in the morning, everyone puts their pants on the same way that you do. So don't be intimidated by the challenges of the day.
I have a quote that I have at the top of my notes document. It's basically, there's nothing to fear. Just go for it. Play to win. Don't play to not lose.
Attitude is everything.
A closed mouth never gets fed.
Maya, and I'm wondering, because we haven't had a chance to discuss this properly, but what is your one mantra that has shaped your life?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I really like this quote that really started my inner regeneration work. It's by Rumi, and it goes something like, yesterday I was clever, so I wanted to change the world, and today I'm wise, so I'm changing myself. And this really reminds me that any change always starts from within. How about you? What's your mantra or quote?
Beautiful. I think my favorite phrase that I always come back to actually is very Czech. I'm from the Czech Republic, and it has been around for a while. It's something like, if you're the only one that can, then you must. And I really like it because I think some people, use it to mobilize themselves or realize that, well, if I'm here at this point of time and space and I have the capacity to act, then I have to, because no one else is going to do it, right? So I think that's really nice, kind of action-oriented thing, and also kind of gives us some moral responsibility that, we are even just the fact that we can have this conversation means that we are incredibly privileged. So what are we going to do about it? So that's something that I like to think about.
Beautiful. I love this. And I guess going off these short questions.
Yeah, I know that the rapid fire is something that we really enjoyed doing. And I know we prepared a little experiment of doing these two together too, and having 2 surprise questions each. So if that's okay, I'll start with mine. So Maya, I want to know, what is your little joy in life that keeps you grounded?
I love it. Okay. I love going to a neighborhood coffee shop, ordering a cup of matcha, something kind of early in the morning, and just sitting outside and slowly sipping my matcha and just people watching, staring outside. And that really helps me ground for the day. And there's something very soothing about having a warm drink being in a community and seeing other people to, coming to this, like, I just love third spaces, coffee shops is my thing. Yeah, and at the same time connecting with the environment around me, practicing that mindfulness. Okay, I have a surprise one for you. What is your most regenerative place in the world?
Oh, well, I'm based in Colombia, and there's so many beautiful places just like around the city that you can go to. And it's incredible because one of my friends has like a cottage in the nature. And when I went, I noticed that he has like a river there with a waterfall. And I'm like, wow, this is wealth, being able to go to these places and connect with nature the same way that people did 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, and, like feel the same emotion and just like really feel human. So I would say rivers in Colombia specifically. And I'm going to go back at you with my second question. I wonder, Maya, what's a subject or topic that you wish was taught in school that would help advance ReFi?
Wow, what a wonderful question. For ReFi specifically, I think back to that kind of inner regeneration topic that we already touched on a little bit, I wish there was like a mindfulness course that was taught early on in school, like for kids, and kind of in relationship to nature, right? Not just to like, okay, here's biology and this is our animal world and this is how do we look at it more holistically and kind of cultivate the sense in kids that, we are a fundamental part of nature. Maybe even implement some of those practices like go lie in the grass, hug a tree, and connect in those ways. Yeah. And the last one for you, Tereza, I'm really curious, who is your role model?
Wow, that's a real hard one. I think I have a whole list. I think someone that I really admire or like the way he thought was Carl Sagan. And, it's like from the concept of the pale blue dots to little things. And I know I have the book Cosmos in my room, and it says in the beginning something like, in this universe that's like so wide and in this like particular place in time, I'm glad I found Susie, which was his wife. And I think it's like a really, I don't know, it like gives me like a really beautiful lens on life. Like you were talking, like appreciating things that, are so random and beautiful at the same time.
Oh, wow. Thanks for sharing that. I really enjoyed doing these rapid fire surprise questions, and we did not know which ones we were going to ask each other ahead of time. So that was totally on the spot. And as we close out, that as I'm curious for you to reflect and look ahead in the future, what excites you about where the ReFi movement is headed, or where would you like to see it headed?
The initial ReFi moment is over. I think now what comes next, hopefully, is, like really the hard work, like what I mentioned, the case studies with hard numbers, what Wes was talking about as well on his episode about, maybe ReFi initially being defined as tokenization of impact and all that, but there are many other things that we can do. But it's been kind of difficult to drop this label, like tokenized carbon credits, and that's it. So I am kind of really excited to see like different use cases that actually work in the real world. And I really want to be connecting more with builders and seeing what everyone's doing. I am really excited, for example, about MiniPay and the sale ecosystem. I think also Haraka, which is like a microloan project that's just started about a year ago and is now like really picking up. So I think it's going to be an exciting year overall. And I think there's going to be a lot of like redefining as well. And, a lot of projects are going to appear, a lot of are going to disappear. But I hope that, hopefully the overall space keeps advancing. Maya, how about you? Do you have any reflections on that? And also, what are some of the topics that maybe you want to be exploring yourself?
Yeah, I'm totally with you on more real world examples. That I think is always the goal. And I'm also excited to see this trend of more, collaboration across different projects. It's cool to see ReFi and BioFi becoming more of a partnership, and how ReFi local nodes can adopt some of the bioregional approaches in their work. That will be interesting to see. And in terms of the topics that I would love to explore in the future, you kind of mentioned the bonus episode that we recorded with Timur from Edge City. And I'm curious to explore this new trend of pop-up cities and the idea of, building these regenerative communities in certain places and how that could actually look like, and how do we actually make them regenerative and not extractive, right? Like, what does it mean for these people to come into an existing community to build something new, and how that kind of community collaboration could look like? Yeah, and I guess I'm also interested in explore other areas of ReFi that we haven't touched on in the season, because there's just so much to talk about, but not enough time for everything. Is, the questions of waste and technology. How can we use technology to improve our waste collection and plastic pollution, things like that? Another big area, I think, is energy, right? And decentralizing energy and more renewable energy sources, and where technology stands there, as well as the role of AI and how can AI be regenerative? So many things to explore in the future.
Totally. Yeah, this was super fun. We should do it more often. One thing that I'm also going to manifest for this year is that we actually see each other in person again, because I just realized that it's been around a year, I think, since we last saw each other at Denver. So hopefully we can make it happen maybe, during a pop-up community initiative.
I would love that. Yes, definitely manifesting for that to happen, because connection is the most meaningful in person. And I'm thankful for all the tools in the world, but nothing can replace human community in the real life. Just as terrifying as I thought, but also very rewarding to chat through and look back at all the work that we've done. And I want to conclude with a call to action to all our listeners. So first of all, thank you so much to the community who listened to the episodes, who retweeted our posts, who shared their feedback. Please continue doing so. It really matters a lot for us to hear your feedback. Let us know what are some of your takeaways from the season, what your thoughts are on the Regeneration Nexus. Maybe what was your favorite episode, or the idea that stood out to you in the comments. Retweet, share this episode with your friends, and let's continue this conversation.
Totally. Yeah. I also want to say a big thank you. The online space is very oversaturated, and ReFi is still, a big niche. So we really appreciate anyone that helps us push this forward, and we'll definitely be back. So thank you so much.